Well, it's great to see all of you. This is my second year doing this. I think we've been doing this for 2 years now. The topic of the real Housewives of the Bible. That's right. That's what I'm doing here tonight. Just want to make sure, okay? And obviously that's an interesting way of having us study the women of the Bible from a variety of perspectives. You've had some of the finest minds in Los Angeles coming and addressing you, so you're a very, very fortunate group, and I imagine you've been really enjoying yourselves. So anybody for tonight start with just what's one of the main insights you've learned so far from my distinguished colleagues? Anybody have a distinct memory, a thought so far in the course? Yes?
The different points of view within Judaism itself.
The different points of view, meaning on the different,
Yes.
right? So not just the different speakers have a different point of view, but the speakers are pointing out different points of view.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Outstanding. Yes, over here.
That the stories about women have been abysmally neglected over the 2,000 years.
Yeah. The stories about women have been neglected. Okay. Yeah. Abysmally, yes. Yes. It's interesting, in my lifetime, since I was in rabbinical school in the 80s, it's been one of the dominant parts of the curriculum. So I think once you have the feminist movement that begins in the 60s and 70s, for people my age, the idea that the study of women in the Bible is neglected is a foreign concept to me. I mean, in my entire life as a scholar, as a rabbi, it's been a staple of my studies. So I think what maybe has happened is, for those of you who weren't part of that movement, if you're a little bit older than I am, then you're being brought into something that's a key feature of the modern education of certainly non-Orthodox rabbis, but I think Orthodox rabbis as well at this point, at least from the more modern Orthodox. Anybody else? An insight, a thought that you've gained so far that feels significant? Okay, so I'll assume that all of you have been touched, moved, enlightened in your own ways, and hopefully I'll add to that. So the focus that I have tonight, and maybe other teachers have mentioned this, is what is called an archetypal or a Jungian or neo-Jungian approach to Scripture. Have you heard this concept before?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to tell you how I understand it, and you tell me if this is more or less what you have heard so far. And by the way, the archetypal Jungian, neo-Jungian approach is something that's also pretty much a staple of rabbis since the 70s and 80s and so forth. Notice I care to say neo-Jungian. See how carefully I say that? Would you like to know why?
Yeah.
Well, one time when a high holiday service about 10, 15 years ago, I was discussing this approach and going into it very deeply, and a person afterwards came up to me and said, Rabbi Finley, I love the approach, I just don't know what it has to do with Neil Young. I said, okay. They heard the neo-Jungian approach. So I said, Rust Never Sleeps, if you know the album, I said it's, part of Jewish spirituality. So anyway, it is the neo-Jungian. And the idea is the following, that when you look at, for example, a dream, and you try to understand how a dream works, the different characters in a dream, including places, people, animals, events, they speak to us deeply because there's a deep resonance in our inner unconscious lives. It's the unconscious that produces the dream world. So in a way, when you look at a dream, you're studying your own inner landscape. Now, from this perspective, it's also a way of studying literature. When you study literature, when you study poetry, and suddenly you find that one line that speaks to you, that one line that seems to reach into your being and grab a hold of you, or you listen to music, or you look at art, and we're not exactly sure why something has a grasp on us. One of the reasons we think is that there are parts of our own inner lives, typically our subconscious lives, that are addressed and evoked. So one of the ways that we experience the world deeply as human beings, that we grow as human beings and transform as human beings, is by bringing our souls into the presence of these deep archetypal realities, usually presented in most of our lives through literature, poetry, music, art, and I think especially cinema is one of the greatest ways that we are brought into that archetypal reality. Well, since the the writings of Carl Jung, who dies in the 1960s, very active from the 1920s on. He broke with Freud and tried to understand psychology not as psychology as treating a disease, meaning a person who's undergone a trauma and the trauma is presenting symptoms, and if you talk it out, then the symptoms will disappear as you become aware of the trauma. It's a very Freudian approach. Jung says people aren't suffering necessarily because they had a trauma. We suffer because we're human beings. And part of our suffering as human beings is dealing with the irreducible tensions inside each of us. Because we think that when we walk around the world, because we walk around relatively in a stable body and usually in a stable life, we think that we're one stable being. Well, every human being is actually filled with tensions, with different drives. Every one of us has many lives that we haven't lived. We've all made choices, and sometimes our choices were hard. And just because you made one choice or another doesn't mean the other choice would not have led you somewhere in life that would have been maybe as beautiful and maybe as good. So part of what it means to be a human being is not just the life you've lived, but the lives that you haven't lived. And the parts of yourself that, in a way, stay submerged because we haven't fully expressed them in life. So from Jung's perspective, one reason people suffer is because they have unlived lives. They have unlived parts of the self. And one way that we live out those parts of the self is to engage in their psychic reality. They're real parts of the self that need to be brought into consciousness, and Jung would say integrated. So Jung has a very powerful influence, interesting, on scriptural study, because people began to look at scripture in ways that were heretofore unseen. So one way it was, is it literal, which is, you might say, the fundamentalist Orthodox approach, or is it laws and stories out of the ancient Near Eastern context? One or the other. And then a poetic approach says the truth value of it is not whether it historically happened. The truth value of it is whether it speaks a truth. Because there are things that happen that don't transform us, that don't mean much to us. And there are things that, as it were, didn't historically happen, for example, in literature and cinema and so forth, that you might be watching a movie that is not about historical events, but when you walk out of that movie, you know that someone just put something on the screen that's deeply and utterly true, and when you saw that, your life made sense in a way that it didn't make sense before. So the world of symbols can sometimes be more true than what you might call historical reality, in the same way that poetry is true, philosophy is true, etc. So therefore, when we look at scripture, we're no longer asking, is this a story or is it true, which is the Hebrew school question. The Hebrew school students say, Rabbi, is this true? Did this really happen? And I say, you know, as I teach the older kids from about 7th grade and up, I said, look, you're too old for that question. I said, if you mean, can I empirically demonstrate it? Let me give you an analogy. We hold these truths to be as self-evident that all human beings are endowed with unalienable rights. I say, can you demonstrate a right? Can you prove a right? Can you empirically show me? I said, it's a metaphysical truth. But it's a kind of a metaphysical truth that people live their lives around. So the things that are most deeply true are not the things you can demonstrate empirically. The things that are most deeply true are the ones that shape our lives. So in some way, when we study scripture, we're not asking historical or fictional. We're asking, what is the truth value in a different way? So when we study scripture from this perspective, when we look at the characters in scripture, all of the characters, I think for the purposes of these a few years together, the women characters, do they speak a truth to us that help us understand our own lives better and understand better what our lives should be? Now, from this archetypal perspective, we're not studying women. We're studying archetypes, and therefore they equally exist in men and women. Okay. So remember, from an archetypal perspective, we all each have feminine and masculine imagery within. Your gender doesn't make you a greater repository of feminine or masculine imagery. Okay, so this feminine and masculine imagery is completely equal. Putting it another way, I might describe a feminine archetype, and a woman might say, it doesn't speak to me. And a man will say, it speaks to me very deeply. I might describe a masculine archetype, and the man may say, I don't really get that. And the woman will say, that really helps me understand who I am. So one thing I want to say at the beginning, when I talk about my topic tonight, the daughters of Zelophechad, I don't mean that this is about women. What I mean is, it's a feminine archetype in the Bible that speaks to all humanity. Okay, so is this more or less what you've learned about archetypal psychology and the Neo-Jungian approach of this? Go ahead and grant that. Okay, it's very what? It's very me. Very new. Okay, I think it's a very you. I said, wait a minute, you don't know me that well yet, so. Okay, all right. Yeah, it's very new. I mean, it's new except that it's been around since the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but it is really making a deep imprint. In fact, most of the way that I teach scripture in my synagogue is through this Neo-Jungian approach. Okay, so now to our text. We're going to be talking about the Benot Zelophechad. It's an odd name. We're not exactly sure where this fellow Zelophechad comes from. If you're interested in Hebrew etymology, the Hebrew word sel means a shadow. It can also mean a refuge in some ways. And pachad means fear. So Zelophechad might mean something like shelter from fear. If you just want to know what the name Zelophechad might mean. So he has 5 daughters. And there's a certain moment in the Bible, and you'll see this on the side where it says Numbers chapter 27, 1 through 8. If you're not looking at it, turn your page over. Okay, there it is. And in Numbers chapter 27, verses 1 through 8, the people of Israel are now at the borders of Canaan, probably across from Jericho in the plains of Moab. And in these chapters, Aaron dies. Miriam has died. Moses knows that he's going to die. They're getting all kinds of things settled. Before the book of Deuteronomy opens up, Moses gives 3 last speeches, a few more laws, a few poems. Moses dies, and then the people enter into the land of Canaan to become the land of Israel. So this is in the 40th year in the desert. So in the 40th year of the desert, the 5 daughters of Zelophechad come to Moses before Eliezer, before everybody, and say, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not in the company of those who gathered themselves together against God in the company of Korach." Does anybody remember who Korach was? Okay, so in a couple of words, who is Korach? He's the archetypal what? The villain. Very good. He's an archetypal villain. He's a seditious man. What he does is, Korach seems to be envious that his cousin Moses, another Levite like himself, has achieved the greatness of being the prophet, and his other cousin Aaron is the high priest. So Korach, under the guise of egalitarianism, says, how dare that you have lifted yourself above everybody else? Isn't everyone equal? Now notice, Korach doesn't start by saying, and I hereby divest myself of the Levitical robe. He doesn't really make himself equal. He accuses Moses and Aaron of having exalted themselves. Now Moses and Aaron's response could easily be, we didn't exalt ourselves, God chose us. We didn't ask for this. Moses had fled Egypt, was out in the Sinai desert, minding his own business, taking care of his father-in-law Yittro's flock, when God intrudes into his life in the burning bush, and God chooses Aaron. It's a very big scandal. Moses and Aaron are devastated by the personal attack. God sorts it out between Moses and Aaron on one side and Korach and his group on the other. And what happens to Korach and his group? The earth opens up and swallows down Korach and his group. So Korach is the archetype of the person who, in a way, is having what we call a private battle in a public place. You see this sometimes in organizations, even in synagogues and other communities, where a person has a personal vendetta, a personal anger, but they pretend it's about an issue, but it's really personal. And one way you know that it's personal is they don't do it in a proper, dignified way. They ambush the person in public, they talk behind their back, they gossip to them. This is the Korach method. Korach isn't really as interested in solving anything. Korach just wants to destroy Moses. And he pretends that it's a principle. So the first thing the daughter of Zelophechad say is, we're not that group. Our father was not in that group. It's a way of introducing who they are. They want Moses to know, we're not in that group. So they properly come before Moses and everyone and say, our father has died, but he's not in the Korach group. And then they say the following. Our father died and had no sons. Now the law of inheritance was, if a man dies, has no sons, the land goes to his brother, not to the daughters. So the daughters do not inherit from the father. And they say, why should the name of our father be taken away from his family? Because he had no sons. Give us the possession among the brothers of our father. And Moses brings the case to God. And God says, the daughters of Zelophechad speak right. Give them an inheritance. Which means God changes the Torah. Which answers the question, how many people wrote the Torah? Okay? What's the usual answer? 1, Moses, not right. Okay? You can add Joshua, because at the very end of the Bible, Moses dies, and people say Joshua finished it up. So 2 would be a good answer, a little more knowledgeable. But now you have the full answer, which is 7. Moses, Joshua, and the 5 daughters of Zelophechad. Now, you can breeze right by this Torah. Those of you who have read the Torah portion every week for many, many years, you can breeze right by this and not understand the stunning implications here. God gives the law. You know the story that we say, it's the perfect mind of God from Mount Sinai through God, mind of Moses, out to the people, the one valid law for all generations, right? Except, not so much. Because the daughters of Zelophechad, they say, actually, there's a mistake here. They bring it to Moses. Moses says, you got a point. Let me take it upstairs. Moses takes it upstairs. God says, they have a point. Change the law. Now, this is a stunning idea. Think of just the theory of Torah. The theory of Torah here is that not that God delivers over a perfect set Torah, but rather it's a Torah of becoming. Not a static perfect Torah, but that a Torah that becomes more and more perfect because the people of Torah critique Torah, bring it to God, and Torah is changed because we are a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and therefore what we think about Torah counts as well. Now, this idea that the people of Israel can critique Torah to God and God changes Torah is enshrined in the idea of the oral law. Now, the written law doesn't change since this time, but as you know, generation after generation, the Mishnah, the Talmud, etc., the law continues to evolve and grow, out of which, by the way, came the conservative movement, the reform movement, etc. And I would say, even if you look in the Orthodox tradition, as I'll try to show tonight, the idea that Torah continues to evolve and grow, you see in the Orthodox tradition, and especially in the traditions that, in my mind, come straight out of the daughters of Zelophechad. Okay, so that's the first point that I want to mention. Any comments, questions, or thought about that first run at the text? Okay. All right, so my next question is, why do they take pains in saying that their father was not of the Korach group? And the rabbis, when the rabbis of the Midrash, you all know what the Midrash is by this point, correct? Does anybody not know? Okay, so it's the sustained rabbinic commentaries. So when the rabbis see a line that says, our father died from his own sin, the rabbis are asking, well, who is this guy? You wouldn't mention him if you didn't want us to know who he is. So the rabbis identify with their father, with the man in the book of Numbers, chapter 15, who's called the Mikoshesh Ha'etzim, the gatherer of the sticks. That's their father. Now, who's the gatherer of the sticks? Anybody know who that guy is? He does it on the Sabbath day, right? And he gets stoned to death. This is not a very popular story to tell nowadays. I think in medieval times they may have liked it, but it's a little bit out of the, how shall I say, it cuts against the grain of our modern liberal nature. But it's actually worth going into a little bit. When does this man go out? Their father. He's the father of the daughters of Zelophechad. This is significant. Why does he go out and gather sticks? What has just happened if this is happening in Numbers 15, what just happened in Numbers 14? I'm just relying on anybody's just general biblical knowledge here. What happens in Numbers 13 and 14? Anybody remember? It's the story of the spies. They arrive at the borders of Canaan. They send out the 12 spies. 12 spies come back. 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, say, we can do it, let's go in. What do the 10 spies say? We can't do it. So they infect people with the hysteria that not only can't they do it, but God actually brought them out of Egypt in order to kill them. God brought them to hurt them. And therefore they should go back to Egypt where life was good, where they had enough to eat, where Pharaoh was the one who was really going to take care of them. So look what happens, what fear and anger do. Fear is, we can't do this. We got to be angry at somebody. Let's be angry at Moses and Aaron and God who tried to destroy us. And let's go back to that good guy, Pharaoh. So what's happened is their entire lives have become utterly distorted because of their fear. Now, this is a very common idea in spiritual psychology. Why is it that people get things so wrong? Have you ever had dealings with another human being? You're trying to solve a problem, and they tell you what they saw, what they heard, what they think, and you look at them and say, how could they have possibly come up with that idea, right? Sometimes it's the person sitting next to you tonight, right? Sometimes when I counsel husbands and wives, and I hear the two different stories, right? I'm really surprised they're actually living on the same home from different planets. They really don't understand each other. And with children, and with friends, and again in synagogues, people have such utterly different narratives to tell. And so the question is, if they were both there, and we assume something really did happen, why do people understand things so differently? Well, there are emotional, psychological pressures that build up that distort our thinking. So the story of the spies is a classic text, an archetypal text, in how people arrive with distorted thinking that then gives them the decision to do crazy, destructive things. Now, what is God's response to the spies? Everybody gets hysterical. Everybody wants to kill Moses, kill Aaron, run back to Egypt. What does God say?
Kill all of you.
Not exactly kill all of them, but
They will die.
they'll die in the desert. Okay? Now, how long had they been in the desert up until this point? 2 years. Just 2 years. Now, what happens, God says, is none of you are going to live to enter the land. You will stay here for 38 more years. How many people heard that the Jews wandered in the desert for 40 years? Not true. Erase that from your memories. Okay? That's not true. Never says in the Bible that they wandered in the desert for 40 years. It took them, they got to Mount Sinai. They stayed at Mount Sinai, by the way, for almost 2 years. They left Mount Sinai, using Gregorian calendar, in about May. They arrived in the land to the border of Canaan around August. Right? So it takes them, in July. It takes them maybe 6 weeks. 6 weeks to get from Mount Sinai to the borders of Canaan. Okay? You can look at the Bible. This is all in Torah portion Beha'alotecha. You'll see it in Numbers chapter 10 and 11. It takes them 6 weeks to get from Sinai to Canaan. Very good. Because what God says is, it takes them 6 weeks to get there. They have this disastrous thing with the spies. And God says, you will now stay in the desert for 38 more years, meaning in total 40, and you will be ro'ei midbar, which means desert shepherds. It doesn't say to'ei midbar, desert wanderers. It says ro'ei midbar, desert shepherds. You can look it up. It's in the book of Numbers chapter 14. Okay? It never says we wandered in the desert for 40 years. Okay? They knew exactly where they were for 38 years. Where were they? Time out. They had time out for 38 years. Okay? We know exactly where it was. They were in a place called Kadesh Barnea in the Sinai desert for 38 years. 38 years goes by. They cross the Negev desert, go up the Jordan Valley on the Jordanian side. They're in the plains of Moab, getting ready to come down. Now, as soon as Moses says, for God, he says 38 more years, there are some people that say, we're out. We don't want to be here anymore. We quit. Now, what's the problem? What kind of neighborhood are they in the Sinai desert? The same one we're in today. Okay? The same one we're in today. So you think that Hamas and Hezbollah and the Muslim Brotherhood, you think this is new? It's the same people with a different religion and a different ideology, right? But if you look in the Midrash, you look in the Bible, they want to kill us. It's unreasonable, it's fanatical, it's an implacable kind of hatred. But if you look in the Bible, by the way, who's the archetype of the irrational, implacable hater of Israel? Anybody know who that is? Amalek, exactly right. So Amalek wants to get us, and Amalek is right there. He's right there. He's right outside the camp. Amalek is waiting for us. So what happens if the people rise in revolt and the social cohesion falls apart? What's going to happen to us? We'll be killed, right? We'll be slaughtered if the morale starts to break down. So this one guy says, I quit. Now the question is, how do you quit? How do you symbolize that you're out? What do? Break the Sabbath in public. Now we're not talking about someone who breaks the Sabbath in private. Now and then it's late summer, it's summertime, the days are long, the game is on, right? It's like Shabbos till like 9 o'clock. So people pull down the shades and they make sure everybody's out of the house and they sneak into the den, they turn the TV on low. We're not talking about a little bit of Shabbos weakness. We're talking about in front of the synagogue, setting up shop, watching TV in front to say, I quit, I'm out. Now what's the problem with doing, it's called befarhesia. They're sinning in secret, they're sinning befarhesia. And befarhesia is a problem because you're actually poking it in the eye of other people. So the problem with Mekoshesh ha'etzim is he went out gathering sticks on Shabbos in front of everyone. So they catch the guy. Now the question is, what do we do? They put him in the mishmar in the guard. God takes it to, Moses takes it to God. God says, you have to execute him. And they stone the man to death. People say, oh, it's very harsh. That's what I hear. Every time I teach people, oh, it's very harsh. And, I'm very lucky to have had an analogy. And I have two analogies, actually. I'll tell you each as briefly as I can. My mother was 15 years old in the Blitz in 1940, before she was sent out of the city. And Churchill gave an order of martial law during the bombing of London, which was that looters will be shot on sight. Now, this was an object of wonderment to her because they were being bombed and they were hungry. And they walked through the streets of London, and there would be a market bombed out with the goods pouring into the street, all these foodstuffs. And the Londoners would carefully tiptoe through it and not pick up one can, not pick up one article. And she thought this was an amazing thing until she realized that their reticence was stiffened by the threat of being shot to death, right? That will influence your behavior, by the way. But there were no British soldiers on every corner. They weren't standing there. So she realized something very much more deep as a 15-year-old girl. She said, the Germans can bomb our cities. They can kill us. But they can't bomb us out of our dignity. We're not going to be turned into scavengers. We're not going to be turned into animals. If the law is we don't pick stuff off the street, we don't pick up stuff off the street. Okay? They're Nazis, we're British. So there's a very deep pride in the fact that they would not succumb to this. Now, there were a few people that were shot. And in the mind of most Londoners, properly so. Because the minute someone starts to break ranks and loot because of the Nazi bombing, it breaks everybody down. So I'll just give you that one analogy. So I remember when I read this, I was about my mom's age when I read in synagogue for the first time. And I read it, I remember saying, oh, this is horrible. I said, I don't think it's horrible because my mom told me a story about when she was living in London during the Blitz. Sometimes the one guy that says, well, I quit, sometimes that guy has to be taken care of in a very severe way. It's martial law. So he died because if he were allowed to continue, if other people began to imitate him, the social cohesion would fall apart. They would not be able to protect themselves. The Amalekites would strike. They'd massacre everybody. They had to hold the line. Okay? So that's their father. Okay? Any questions, comments about that? So now we actually begin to see a little bit of a tie, an archetypal tie between the father and the daughters. Okay? I want us to think about for a moment. What is it that the daughters have an instinct about regarding God's law? They have an instinct. When they see the law of inheritance, they know something about this law. And what is it? They know, the law says you're not entitled to inheritance. What do they know about that law morally? It's wrong. It's wrong. Now here is a very interesting and troubling thing in moral theory. In moral theory, you might say, I think we have three kinds of moral codes. One is the public code that we hope works most of the time. Ideally, it will work all the time, which means the public code actually accords with our personal sense of right and wrong and virtue. That's the ideal situation. It always happens, though, that people have an inner virtue code, their own inner sense of what's right and wrong. It bumps up against the public moral code, and people say, it's wrong. I know it's the law. I know everybody's conforming to it. It's wrong. And what's the most notable example of the idea of the personal virtue code going against the public moral code in recent American history? What would that be? Yeah, the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement would be a perfect example. We know it's the law, people seem to agree, but it's wrong. And therefore, we're going to come out against it. Now, so the father, Zelophechad, Mikoshesh ha'etzim, the stick gatherer, he's the kind of guy that had an instinct that this was wrong, but the problem is, in retrospect, we know that he was wrong. Okay, so that's the third code. This is my own little private designation. We have the public moral code, the personal virtue code, which sometimes contradicts the public code, and then what I've come to call, from my years and years of counseling, the code from hell. Okay? Now, why do I call it the code from hell? Is because people license to themselves the most outrageous things with the most bizarre, flimsy excuses. And they justify themselves. I give you an example. I'm counseling, I'm doing a little session on managing anger. By the way, Jewish tradition, you can feel anger. You're not supposed to express anger. You got something to say, calm yourself down, say it in a rational and clear way. Don't rage, because when you rage, you say horrible things, you hurt people. Hardly ever does any good come from it unless you are actually defending your life, the life of somebody else, or something like that. And in general, expressing anger is almost always hurtful. So here's the deal. I'm teaching a man challenges me. He says, Rabbi, I don't know if I agree with you. I said, okay, what's the story? He says, for years I was telling my daughter to take out the trash cans, and she wouldn't do it, and every Tuesday night it came around, and Wednesday it wasn't done, and it happened a few times. So of course I yelled at her. What else was I going to do? I said, and why did you yell at her? I had to teach her a lesson. I said, okay, what was the lesson plan? But what lesson? Did you ever actually teach or just punish? Well, I just had to let her know. I said, how long did this go on? 4 years, until she moved out. Okay. So I said, okay, so after the first couple months, by the way, does this sound familiar? That people just, they're angry, they know what to do. So I said, how did it get any better? He says, no. I said, why'd you keep doing it? You know what he says to me? I didn't know what else to do. That was his excuse. He's like, you have a leak in your roof, you have one tool, hammer, so you go up and you hammer on the leak, saying, I don't have any other tools, I just keep hammering on the roof, maybe it'll work, right? So when people justify what they do, they come up with the most bizarre theories, and they actually believe themselves. And this guy really does. He said, what else was I supposed to do? I said, maybe nothing. Right? If your only tool in your kit is yelling at your kid, maybe you just do nothing until you figure it out. Maybe you take that one out of your toolkit. So over and over again, when I counsel people, the reason they do things is, I didn't know what else to do, as if that's a reason for doing anything. So the idea that people have bad theories, that they can't think straight, is something that I see over and over again. So with this man, with his resentment, with his anger, he says, I don't like what's going on, I feel this is wrong, I'm just going to pick up sticks on the Sabbath and quit. You see, now his own personal moral code, had he influenced other people, could have led to widespread havoc and destruction. So that's where, when a person says, oh, I know what's right, I'm going to break the moral law, I'm going to do my own thing, that can be profoundly destructive. But you look at his daughters, right? What his daughters don't do is they don't rebel, they don't do something destructive like their father, they're not seditious in the background, gossiping and maligning and so forth like Korah. They make a case. They get up in public and they make a case. And you know what's great about making a case in public? That if you're wrong, you can probably be shown so rationally. And if somebody else is wrong, you can probably display it rationally. So the daughters of Zelophechad have a little bit of their father's instinct, which is, when something's wrong, don't just sit there, okay? Which is they get from their father. But obviously from their unnamed mother, they get something else, which is the restraint and the rationality. So the daughters of Zelophechad, you might say, is the archetype of the person who says, I'm not going to go with the public code just because it's the public code. That's not good enough for me. On the other hand, what I'm not going to do is say that since I don't like what's going on, I'm going to be destructive. Now just think of your own lives. How many times have you seen a person that was frustrated with another person or frustrated with an organization and decided they didn't like it and they went on the attack? Have you seen this? You know how profoundly destructive it is. So the daughters of Zelophechad, you might say, is the archetype of not engaging in that kind of destructive behavior. So what we're doing by looking at these texts is beginning to get a little bit of a sense of who the daughters of Zelophechad are from an archetypal perspective. Okay? Any questions or comments about this? Okay? So I want to take it back another level. So the other level, now this is where I'm more or less on my own midrashic ground. And here's how midrash happens, is you look at the text, you look at the commentaries, and you begin to see a midrashic possibility open up. So I look back at a very famous narrative in our tradition, and it's the narrative of the molten calf incident. Okay? The molten calf incident. People call it the golden calf incident in Exodus chapter 32. It's never called the golden calf in Exodus 32. It's called the molten calf, meaning a calf made from a mold, where metal is poured into a mold. Okay? So what's the basic narrative? We get out of Mount Sinai, we get out of Egypt, we come to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up on the mountain for how long? 40 days and 40 nights. He's supposed to come down, and what are the people supposed to do while he's up there? Nothing. Just nothing. They basically should be entirely focused on waiting. Okay. But what happens when people sit around and wait? Anxiety starts to take over. Now, what is there? Now, we don't know why they built the molten calf. We know what they say. What the Bible says is Moses is delayed from coming down the mountain. That man Moses, like that guy. We don't know exactly who he is. It says, Ha'ishazeh, that man Moses. Right? Even the language sets up a kind of a distance. We don't know what happened to him, probably meaning he might be dead, maybe meaning we hope he's dead. Right? And why might they secretly hope he's dead? Because what's he coming down the mountain with? Law. He's coming down the mountain with law. Okay? And once he arrives with the law, what's going to happen to their lives? Their lives are going to be changed. They're going to be lives filled with restraint. They can't do, think, say whatever they want. They will have to live a life of restraint. Which, by the way, folks, is essentially what morality is. Morality is restraint. You can't say everything you feel. You can't do everything you feel. In fact, from a Jewish perspective, you can't think everything you feel like thinking, because some thoughts are not healthy. We're taught in our tradition, don't hate. Okay? That's a feeling. Those are thoughts. If you have repetitive thoughts of hatred and so forth, in general, our tradition says, don't go there. Think healthier thoughts. Because filling yourself with toxic thoughts, toxic feelings, and so forth will create a toxic person who will probably end up doing toxic things. Okay? So when they know when the law comes down, their life is going to change. So one theory is they hope Moses is dead because when he comes down, their life is going to change. They will have to live lives of restraint. So what they say is that he's late. Moses is boses la redet min hahar. He's delayed coming down the mountain. Now, why did they think he's delayed? Okay. He's supposed to be gone for 40 days. So the Midrash here is very interesting. What the Midrash says is they counted the 40 days from when he left, when he went up the mountain, 6 o'clock. He counted the 40 days from when he got there. Okay? So it took him a few hours to get up the mountain. So once their clocks hit 6, they said he's late. 6:01, 6:02, 6:03, 6:04, he's dead. Right? Moses thinks, well, I'm going to count from when I get there, and even so I have a little bit of slack. He had no slack with these people because the whole 40 days their anxiety is getting greater and greater and greater. Finally 6:01, 6:02 say, that's it, he's dead. We want to have a different religion. Now, what's the religion that they build? They build the molten calf. Now, idol worship, okay? But also it's an idol. In those days, the molten calf was an idol of fertility and kind of an animal power. Now, this is, you might say, the opposite of the kind of religion that was on its way down the mountain, which was a religion of consciousness and restraint. Remember, if you build consciousness and restraint in the ego self, that makes room for spirit. It's like the Sabbath. You know, you have the 7 days of activity, and the Sabbath day preserves consciousness. Well, that's part of what it means to be a spiritual and a moral person, is you don't let the world of feelings and drives and impulses govern you. You actually create a space for something holy and for something conscious to come through. So you think of the density and the thickness of the molten calf, which they build in opposition to what Moses is likely bringing down the mountain. Now, how do they get the gold for the molten calf? Right? The earrings of the men. Men. If you go back to Genesis chapter 32, it says, they got the ring. Moses said, take the ring. I'm sorry, yeah, from the women, but the men took them. He says, take the earrings from your wives. Go grab your wife's gold and your own earrings. Right? These are very modern men. Okay? Some had it left, some had the right, some had both. Right? They went and got the earrings. They melted them down, made the molten calf. And it says, so the Midrash points out that the Bible says the men, and therefore the Midrash says the women did not give up their gold. The women did not give up their gold to build the molten calf. Right? Isn't that fascinating? Right? Now, so what you see here is an archetype of the women. Now, so here's my Midrash. What's the difference between the men and the women? Right? The women have more backbone. Women are more spiritual. Okay? Those are all good. Here's my private answer. The women had better leadership.
Yes.
That's my private answer. My private answer is the women had better leadership. Because human beings, I think, what's that? Absolutely. Yeah, but which sisterhood? What do you think I'm going to say? The daughters of Zelophechad. This is my theory. This is my own midrashic theory. Because if everybody is anxious about this thing, right? And at some level, men and women are, we're structured we're very different, but we're structured in a very similar way. But when this anxiety happens, remember Moses up on the mountain, so one great leader is gone. Aaron has his thing going on because the Midrash says Aaron's just trying to buy time. He says they're going to kill Moses when he comes back. So if I can buy time, build this other thing, I'll create some space. So Aaron is such a peacemaker that his desire for compromise in a way becomes his fault. Because there are some times when you compromise and you want to have that balanced medial position, and sometimes that's just wrong. Sometimes the right thing is to say what the virtuous thing to do and hold the line and not try to compromise everything. So this was for Aaron the time to compromise. Sometimes it's the right thing to do. Sometimes it's the wrong thing to do. So this was the wrong thing to do in Aaron's case. He says, okay, give me all your gold. Give me all your gold. We'll make a molten calf, hoping that the men will say, hey, wait a minute. We don't mind a new religion, but don't come after my gold, right? Not knowing that men would say, here's our gold and here's our wives' gold. We're going to gather all the gold up. They got very much behind this new religion. So Aaron builds the calf, but the women don't. So here's my midrashic theory is the daughters of Zelophechad as an archetype that say to the women, stop it. Stop it. Right? And you might say, here's the case they make. Okay? Now, by the way, it's not a very difficult case, but here's the one thing, again, I found from years and years of being a rabbi and counseling. Sometimes the most important case to make to a person is the most obvious case. Because remember, like the generation of the spies, when people are under moral stress, they forget the obvious. They forget the obvious. So here's my guess of what the daughters of Zelophechad said to the women. He said, hold on a second. Do you remember Egypt? How awful it was? Do you remember how beaten down we were? Do you remember that it was the God of our ancestors who came in through Moses, inflicted terrible punishments with signs and wonders on the Egyptians, led us to the Sea of Reeds, opened the sea, brought us through, destroyed the Egyptian army, brought us to this place, and is now going to give us a law to elevate us and dignify us because we are kingdom, priest, and a holy nation? And you guys can't wait a couple hours? You should be able to wait a couple of hours. And with this kind of talk in my imagination, the people went, oh, the women, oh, you're right, they calmed down. So the daughters of Zelophechad were able to quiet the women and said, let's just wait a little bit. Let's just wait a little bit. We owe something to the God who has redeemed us. And what the God who has redeemed us is going to give us is a law that just as we were redeemed from Egypt, from the oppression of the Egyptians, this law will redeem us from our lower selves. This is a law that will elevate us. Let's just trust. Let's hold on here. So the daughters of Zelophechad, in my mind, correspond to something in every human being, the war inside of every human being, right? Because we all have moments like the golden calf incident where you're so afraid, you're so angry, you're so resentful that emotions start to take over you, you forget the obvious and say and do horrible things. And then the other side, you might say there's the good counsel of the daughters of Zelophechad who say, everybody just wait, everybody be quiet. That's a part of the conscience of every human being that says, calm down, slow down. Quit thinking so fast, pause, take a breath, and think what is the right thing to do. Now, you don't know what the right thing to do is, and so you think a little bit. You don't know, because sometimes the instinct is right, sometimes the instinct is wrong. Here, the instinct of the men to deliver over their gold was wrong. And the pause gave them enough restraint where they could think of what the right thing to do was. So in my midrashic theory, when I think of the archetype of the daughters of Zelophechad, they're the ones that are not like their father, or they have something of their father that says something's wrong here, but unlike their father, they don't do it destructively. They're not like the Korach group. Clearly, they identify themselves as we're not like them. In fact, the energy of the daughters of Zelophechad go all the way back to the molten calf incident, where the divide of the men and the women are those who, you might say, act on the anger, the fear, the anxiety, and do something destructive, as opposed to those who are able to think clearly and do what is spiritually and morally the right thing. Okay? So, any questions, comments so far? Yes?
Why didn't the woman fight back? Why I said, well, hey, you're taking my gold.
Yeah.
Kill that.
Yeah, so the question is, why didn't the women fight back? I mean, remember, in every midrash, the claim of the midrash is not that you can defend it on every level, because it's more of a symbolic suggestion. But since you're asking, my guess is, oftentimes when people are that frantic, to stand in their face is to be ready actually for a physical altercation. The midrash says the women just hid the gold. The men said, where's the gold? He says, I thought I gave it to you. Right? I don't know where it is. Right? I thought you knew. Right? So what the women is, they hide the gold, they just delay. The men are frantic, they're running around in a frenzy. And remember, the men are so distracted anyway that they build the calf. All right, so now we have an image. Oh, question over here, yes.
Yeah. The timeline confuses me. Why would you think that it was the daughters that were the calming effect? Because they haven't been introduced yet until this, Numbers where it says, then came the daughters, and that whole story. So why would you think that they
Yeah, this is a basic rule of midrash.
Okay.
Remember, first in the Bible, people lived extraordinarily long times, right? So the fact that the age might be off a little bit is not a problem biblically speaking. But here's what the midrash tries to do. The midrash has a theory. Here's my name of the midrashic theory. It's called parsimony of personages, which means if you have somebody here that's notable for something, and something happens back here, but you don't know who it was, but it's like them, it's probably the same one. Okay? You know the most famous example of this? The most famous example is when the Israelites are getting ready to move into the Sea of Reeds. Now the story is, the Bible says, they walked into the sea on dry ground. You've heard that before? So here's the midrash. One guy puts his foot in, and what happens? The water parts because he's put his foot in. Another midrash says he walked all the way in until the sea was up to his mouth, and then the sea parted. Okay? Question is, who was that guy? Anybody know what his name is? Nachshon ben Aminadab. Exactly. Now this happens in the book of Exodus chapter 14. Is his name given there? No. Where does the name Nachshon ben Aminadab come from? Way later on in the book of Numbers, if I'm not mistaken. All the tribes are lining up to give their gifts to God. And the first tribe is the tribe of Judah. And who's the first prince? Nachshon ben Aminadab. So the rabbis say, why does he get the honor? They said, oh, here's a guy who has an honor but no deed. There's a deed with no guy, so it's obvious who the guy must be. Okay? Now, so people say, oh, Nachshon ben Aminadab. And I said, how do you know? They actually think they're going to find it in Exodus 14. It's not there. How'd they come up with it? I said, it's obvious. He got a prize here. We don't know who the guy is there. Must be the same guy. Over and over again in the Midrash, there's this rule of parsimony. And the parsimony is, if something happens here we don't know who it is, and something happens here we know who it is, it's probably the same person. So I'm running on the midrashic rule of parsimony, right? That says, if it is true in my theory that one reason women held the line because of good leadership, and we show this exemplary leadership in the daughters of Zelophechad in this story, it's probably the same people in the other story. Okay, that's my reasoning. Can anybody poke a hole in my reasoning? I think it's kind of perfect, isn't it? Okay, midrashically perfect. Yeah. Yes.
I have an unrelated question.
Okay.
After the stoning of Zelophechad, whatever,
The stoning of right. Yeah.
it said, goes into this whole business about fringes on the garments and the blue thread.
Mm-hmm.
What is?
Very good. Outstanding. So why is it, after that Zelophechad is stoned, the Mikoshesh ha'etzim, the next thing it says is, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe b'nei Yisrael, v'marta Elohem, you shall say to them, V'asu tzitzit al kantei bigdehem, you will put fringes on the corners of their garments. Why here? You all know about the commandment to wear fringes on the corners of the garment, correct? Okay? Here's where it comes in. It comes in right after the story of this stoning of the man who gathered sticks. Now why? So scholars have puzzled over this until 20th century scholarship, where they discovered that in the ancient biblical world, only certain people were allowed to wear fringes. Who? Aristocracy. Aristocracy. In the ancient Near Eastern world, priests, wealthy, royalty, kings, they were the only ones allowed to wear fringes. It was the insignia of being of a higher status. Right? So who got to wear insignia? The nobility. But what are we told? We are told that we are a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The problem is, we don't have any insignia. We don't have anything to remind us on the outside. Now here's an interesting thing about human nature. Sometimes to remind us who we are on the inside, we need something on the outside. Okay? Now, I have a little anecdote that I tell about this. It was one of the most, it was an odd, strange little thing that happened to me, but it sank home. I was in the Marine Corps when I was younger, and I had made sergeant, and I was stationed down here in El Toro. And there was a new college, Saddleback Community College, not far from my base, and I took an evening class there. And the campus was just being built, and from the parking lot to the campus, there was this winding road that went up. So I'm too impatient to go on the winding road, so I decided I'm going to take the hill. So I'm going up, I have my dress uniform on, I have my dress black shoes on, I'm going up the hill, and it's a little bit steep, and I start to slip in my black dress shoes. Had I had my boots on, I would have been okay, but I was in my dress shoes. So I'm about halfway up, and I realize maybe I should go back down to the road. And I start to turn around, and a woman looks me from the side, and she says, "Marine, you better not turn around." Marine, you better not turn around and go back down that hill. Okay? Because I was wearing the insignia on my collar, on my cover, my hat, sergeant stripes on my sleeves that says, once I start going up a hill, I don't turn around and go back down the hill. Okay? And I looked at her, I said, "Thank you, ma'am," and I went up the hill. I thought that was so interesting, because I thought to myself, I can't make it until someone reminded me, "You're a Marine Corps sergeant, what are you talking about going back down the hill?" Right? And I got to tell you, at that moment, in a way, I had not yet gone to college, but I began to have a theory of religion. Meaning, why do we have these things? Why do we have the tzitzit and tefillin and the yarmulke? And we go in, why all the synagogue? Why all these things from the outside? We have these things on the outside to evoke who we are on the inside, because we forget who we are, which is why we need a life of symbols. The life of external symbols evoke our deeper natures as human beings. It fits very much with the archetypal ideas that I shared with you in the very beginning. Is the archetypal symbols that we encounter that sometimes remind us of who we are on the inside. So what happens with the, at this point, here they are, they're getting ready, what's going to happen to them next, by the way, after they stone this guy to death? What's next for these people? What's next? 38 more years. 38 more years. The heroic life is gone. All they have to do now is raise children to be better than they are. That's it. They have to raise children to be better than they are. A new generation. But it has to be thoughtful, because they can't make children like themselves, people who break under pressure, want to kill Moses, build molten calves, run back to Egypt. They can't make children like they are. They have to make children who are better than they are. So one thing they have to be reminded of is who they are at their best. Okay? For 38 years, what do they know? They're going to die in the desert. You're not going anywhere. When you came out of Egypt, you thought you were going to go into the land of Canaan, in the promised land, and see your future revealed before you. Not anymore. You're going to die in the desert. You will never see the fulfillment of your life. You will never see all your hard work come to fruition. A lot of people will say, well, if I'm not going to benefit from it, and I'm not going to see it, why should I do it? How many of you have heard people? Right? But that, that's not the Jewish way. Right? You know the Jewish way that says, if you're planting a tree and you hear the Messiah has come, what do? Continue planting your tree. Okay? Maybe the Messiah will come, maybe not. But are you planting the tree for yourself? Obviously not. You're planting the tree for future generations. So, I put myself, again, this is an archetypal position. Now, why do I share it from an archetypal position? Because sometimes I meet people in life who are doing things, committing themselves to things, not because it's going to make them feel better soon or maybe even in their lifetimes. They're doing things for the next generation. And they are willing to suffer some privation. They are willing to live some degree of sacrifice. And they say, I'm not going to enjoy the fruit of my labor. I'm not having fun right now. But I will do it for a future generation. I will sacrifice myself to an idea for a future generation. Now, sometimes when I meet people who are struggling and they're not happy and things aren't going their way, I tell them this story. Here are people who said, my life has gone terribly wrong. We're not going to go into the promised land. We're going to die in the desert. Everything we thought was going to happen to our lives is not going to happen. But we have to sit here in the desert, hold the line, and raise good children. That's the best we're going to do with our life. And that's a great thing. So that's what the tzitzit are. The fringes are to tell you, sometimes your life is not about you. Sometimes your life is not about your happiness. Sometimes your life is not about your finding the full meaning of your life. Sometimes your life is about dedication to an idea that's transmitted to another generation. Right? Now notice the idea that you restrain yourself, you can't get everything you want, is part of, you might say, the idea of the daughters of Zelophechad. The men say, we want a God right now that will make us feel better. And the daughters of Zelophechad say, no. We have to wait. Moses is going to come down from the mountain. We're going to have to live a life of restraint. It might not feel good all the time or most of the time. But this life of restraint will elevate us in ways that life will become maybe not always pleasurable, but certainly more deeply meaningful. And so you might say that is part of that spirituality, which is why I put that line in there. Which is, I wanted the line on the tzitzit in there because for me that very much accords with what I'll call the spiritual tone of the daughters of Zelophechad, which is they stand for, in a way, the life of restraint as opposed to the life of gratification. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have lives that feel good and lives that shouldn't have some gratification, but in general, Judaism stands for a life of moral restraint and spiritual dignity as opposed to a hedonistic life of gratification. So in my mind, the blue of the tzitzit is to remind us, that we are earthbound creatures, existentially. Our deepest identity is in the mind of God, in the heavens. So that's the thread of blue.
To me, it's very interesting that blue was made in a certain way by the people in Afghanistan.
The blue was made in a certain way by the people in Afghanistan. Are you saying that in the Sinai desert, they had to go to Afghanistan to get the blue?
I don't know, but
Okay.
I don't know how it got there.
I think they got it from us. It's hard for me to believe that God says, have blue, go to Afghanistan to get it. Bring it back. Right? It's just, right? You'd have to do it like the midrash that I did. That's a way far out midrash compared to my midrash. Okay. All right. So who knows? Might be true. Make a case. Right? Any other questions, comments about any of this? Yes?
I have a question. You were saying the men gave up their gold to make the Muslim happen. The women felt that they, wanted to wait or among themselves have decided that they shouldn't do that. Somehow I have a question about power, which of course is archetypical, like you're saying. And I'm wondering if there's something in there with desire for power with the men or something.
Yeah, when I think about power, it's a strange thing when you talk about what I call authorized power kind of duly constituted moral authority, where you have the power, therefore, to bring the unruly people in line because you have moral authority, like having the police. They have moral authority to catch criminals and to protect the rest of us. In the same way, our conscience, you might say, ought to have power and moral authority, the power to restrain the unruly parts of the self. But here's what oftentimes happens, and again, I'm saying this as a reflective human being and as a counselor for many, many years. Oftentimes in a person, the power for their own moral authority is diminished. And it's the crazy, frantic, anxious, resentful side that takes over. And sometimes there's a still small voice inside that says, you're wrong. You're wrong. And sometimes the more a person defends and justifies, they're defending and justifying so much because there's a voice inside them telling them that they're wrong. So when I think of the power, we all have that internal struggle. So remember, I'm saying this archetypally. From an archetypal perspective, the daughters of Zelophechad stand for, you might say, the repressed power of conscience that finally reasserts itself down the line to even God says, I made a mistake. Which is amazing to me. Where they say, the law is not fair. And God says, you're right, we're rewriting the whole thing. We're rewriting at least this section. Look at the power they have. It's the power of rationality. The power of making a good case. Not sedition, not attack, not defiance, but the power of making a good moral case.
Yeah, they must have had a real powerful feeling inside to resist that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, their own power to resist the molten calf, and the power, you might say here, to do things the right way. And by the way, there is, the idea of a person of power. The rabbis say, Ezehu Gibor, who is a powerful, strong man? What's the answer? Hakovesh it yitzro, the man who can conquer his yetzer, his drive for power. Okay, that's the Gibor. That's a strong person. A strong person is a person who is aggressive, because an aggressive person sometimes doesn't have the power to restrain their own impulses and anger. The most powerful person sometimes is a person of restraint. Again, from a virtue perspective of the Jewish tradition. Okay, so as I'm developing the archetype, you can see where I've gone with the archetype. I'm trying to develop a consistent archetype. So when you see or hear daughters of Zelophechad, you begin to have a sense that it resonates with something internal within you. I want to take one more step, okay? Now the question is, when in the Jewish calendar do we celebrate the daughters of Zelophechad? Okay, on Rosh Chodesh. But where would you think we should celebrate them, by the way? According to my theory, right, to my midrash, what is the most significant thing that they did? In my midrash. Very good, but I think that's a good law they changed. And actually the reason for the law was that the land should not go out of the line of our father. So the new law was, okay, but you can only marry someone from your same tribe. And later that law was revoked anyway. So it was a good law, and then there's even a better law that came around. I'm not saying that's not significant. I think the idea that they could change the Torah is significant. But historically speaking, I think the most significant thing they did from my midrashic perspective was hold the line at the molten calf. They're the ones that held the line at the molten calf. Right? So therefore, what day? Shavuot. Theoretically, again, if my midrash is correct, by the way, I don't know anybody else who has this midrash but me, so I don't expect anybody to celebrate this on Shavuot. But if I were the chief rabbi, I would say, maybe. On Shavuos, one thing we do is we celebrate the daughters of Zelophechad, but that's not when we do it. We do it on Rosh Chodesh. Now the question is, how did that come into being? It's a strange story, and if you turn over, I'll try to go through this little maze of the halachic literature. Okay, so did you all know that we, in addition to reading the Torah on the Sabbath, we also read Torah on the festivals, you knew that, but also during the week, every Monday and Thursday. Very good. What's that? Oh, right. The reason Monday and Thursday is there a question? Okay. The reason every Monday and Thursday is when the laws of reading the Torah came in, according to the rabbis in the time of Ezra, the law was on the marketplace days. The midrash was they should not go more than 3 days without water. There's a line in the Bible. So Shabbos, Monday, Thursday. The public never goes more than 3 days without the public reading of the Torah. Remember, from my theory, it's an external symbol that reminds us who we are, which is a people who are receptacles of the Word of God. Okay? All right. Now, and how many aliyahs, which means when you call people up to the Torah, how many on a Monday, Thursday? 3. On Shabbos, 7. On Yom Kippur, 6. Rosh Hashanah, 5. Okay, and festivals. And on 4, on the intermediate days of festivals, like the intermediate days of Sukkot and Passover, and Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh, you have 4 aliyahs on Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is the first day of the Jewish month, the end of the previous month. It's called beginning of the month. So if you go into a synagogue, if you go into a conservative or Orthodox synagogue on Rosh Chodesh, you'll see 4 aliyahs. Very brief. You'll see 4 aliyahs. Okay, now, so the question is why? Why 4 aliyahs? And so the midrash, here's the Mishnah, says, here it says Mishnah Megillah. On new moons and intermediate days of festivals, 4 read, no more, no less. Okay? That's in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the great code of Jewish law published around 200 CE. Now, then the Gemara, which is the Talmudic commentary in the Mishnah, says, why? What's the general principle? Zeh haklal. This is the general principle. The general principle is that whenever people would be hindered from the work by having an extra aliyah, as on a public day or a public fast in the month of Av, 3 read. But where people would not be hindered from the work because they work less anyway, you could have a 4th aliyah. Which means if people got to get to work, we don't want to delay them with a 4th aliyah. But if they don't work so much anyway, you can go ahead and throw a 4th aliyah in. So the 4th aliyah is an indication that it's a semi-non-work day. It's a semi-non-work day. Clear? So if you go to shul on a weekday morning, it's not a holiday, it's not a festival, and they have 4 aliyahs, what it tells you is it's not such a serious work day. Okay? Just in case you didn't know. There's 4 aliyahs? It's 4 aliyahs? I can go to work late today. Right? Now, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. Because if you've ever gone to a traditional synagogue, how long does an aliyah take on a weekday morning? 40 seconds. Yeah. Blessing before, blessing after, the guy goes through, maybe 2 minutes. So this is not a significant delay in the service to say it's because we work less that day. Right? So I think this zeh klal, sometimes the rabbis say things a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Right? So I don't think the klal is that because there's work. I think the idea is that during the middle days of Passover, the middle days of Sukkot, it's kind of a semi-holiday. So the 4 aliyahs is an indication to tell you, even though they don't take a lot of time, it's a semi-holiday. It's a semi-holiday. Relax a little bit. It's Pesach. It's Sukkot. You can slow down a little bit. But the question is, what sense does this make on Rosh Chodesh? Because Rosh Chodesh is not the middle of Sukkot. It's not the middle of Passover. Why the slowdown? So now we go to the Rashi. Rashi is the great commentator, commentates on the entire Torah, most of the Bible, on most of the Talmud, etc. So Rashi lives 1040 to 1105, south of France. He says, when there's not such a great hindering of work, you can have 4 aliyahs because people work less anyway. And he gives an analogy from Tractate Rosh Hashanah. And then he says, I'm down on the, right here, where it says Rashi, about in the middle there. It says, I heard this from my aged teacher, blessed memory, that this mitzvah was given to them, meaning the women, because they did not remove their earrings from the molten calf. Okay. So what's the mitzvah? The mitzvah of not working. Women have a mitzvah not to work on Rosh Chodesh. He says it's a mitzvah, according to Rashi. So in his time in the south of France, there's a mitzvah that women did not work on Rosh Chodesh. Now, how many women here didn't hear that from your rabbi? Yeah, okay, this is another big secret that's been kept from all of you. Okay? So then Rashi says, I actually found the text. So Rashi is published, And then Rashi comes along and says, I actually found the source. It says, the women obeyed, meaning God, and did not want to give their earrings to their husbands, but rather said to them, you want to make a statue, I said statue here, you want to make a statue and a graven image that has no power to save? They're ridiculing their husbands. The Holy One gave the woman their reward in this world, that they would observe new months more than men, and in the next world they are destined to become renewed, which meaning in the next world men and women will be equal. Okay? Now this tells me that the rabbis, again, here's where I'm doing a little bit of psychological, my own psychological surmising. The rabbis themselves felt that there was something really wrong with the fact that women were treated as second-class citizens. They knew it was wrong. Now, it was the law, but remember, we have the public law and the private code. Their private virtue code said there's something wrong with this. So how did the rabbis themselves explain their own discomfort that women were kept to a lower legal level, even when they knew it was the women who obeyed God more at the molten calf incident, and unlike Korach, and unlike Zelophechad, actually did things righteously and rationally in their own legal case. The rabbis didn't know what to do with it because the law said one thing and their moral instinct said another. So what the rabbis said, this is wrong, but in the next world it's all going to be made right. But in the meantime, there's a placeholder for us to remember that women have been done an injustice, and therefore we as rabbis are going to give them their own special day off, partly because of our own guilt for what's happened to them halakhically, and secondly, to acknowledge that they live on a higher spiritual plane. Now, archetypally speaking, you might say, let's put aside the rabbinic discomfort with the discrimination against women in Jewish law, but let's just say from an archetypal perspective. The daughters of Zelophechad stand for that moment in a human being when you can resist the rush of impulse, the rush of emotion, the rush of anger, the rush of resentment, stop and do the rational and right thing. If archetypally, if I'm right, that's what they stand for. So Rosh Chodesh, therefore, becomes not just a holiday for women, but archetypally a holiday for a certain kind of your own thinking. Now here's an interest that happens in the halakhic history here. So the Tosafot, which is the grandchildren of Rashi. Rashi had only daughters, by the way, which is maybe one reason he thought this way. So his daughters' sons became great rabbis, and they wrote additions, which was what the Hebrew word Tosafot means. And what it says here is, Mutar hu ba'asiyat malacha lehanashim. La'anashim. Work is permitted for men. Asiyat malacha la'anashim. Aval nashim asurot b'malacha lefi shelo pirku nizmehem b'masei ego. But women are prohibited from work because they did not remove their earrings in the incident of the calf. Which means, from this perspective, the woman's prohibition from work on Rosh Chodesh is just as stringent as the prohibition for work for everybody on Shabbat. It's a real serious isur. It's a serious prohibition that women are prohibited from work. This is according to the grandsons of Rashi. Now, the problem is if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the great code of Jewish law published about 1570, and subsequent law, nobody knows anything about this. Right? So I've tracked this law from the Torah through the Tosafot to Rashi to the Shulchan Aruch. Nobody knows anything about this law. Okay? So it comes down to one of the greatest restatements of Jewish law, the Mishnah Berurah, written in the 1920s. He says, women who have this custom, but if any men have it, it's not a custom whatsoever. Men, you can't take this from women. It only belongs to the women. Now, in the Mishnah Berurah, he goes on, I don't want to burn up too much paper here. The Mishnah Berurah goes on for two tiny, tiny, tight-faced spaces on the history of this law, and he has no idea where it's from. He's trying to track it down. So one point he says is that it is a minhag tov, a good custom. So I thought, there's bad customs? Why would he say it's a good custom? Okay? Right. So when the Mishnah says it's a good custom, so by the way, so what I did is, because now you can do this digitally, I looked up every time it says minhag tov in the Mishnah Berurah, right? He says it several times. Every time he says minhag tov, you know why? Because he doesn't know where it came from. He's trying to figure out what's the law, to whom does it apply, to what extent, and what he ends up saying is, we have no idea where it's from, we don't know what the dimensions are from, we don't know what the parameters are, but it's a custom. But it's a custom we know nothing about. So then he says, well, what is the custom? He says, well, you do what your mother did. He says, that's basically the custom. He says, but I even don't want to say that because I don't want to tell women what to do. It's their custom. So then he goes to another source that says, okay, here's what happened. Every woman from the time of the calf decided their own custom, and they therefore bequeathed it to their daughters. Okay? Which only pushes the question further back. You mean each of these women in the time of the molten calf decided their own custom? Based on what? Based on how they felt? It's a fascinating idea, because when you think of Jewish law, you think of the law. There's the beginning point, the stopping point, there's the content, and you have this fascinating area of Jewish law that's all based on personal discretion on what's meaningful to you. What's meaningful to you? So what's the essential, so the bottom line of the Mishnah Berurah, how should each woman observe Rosh Chodesh? In the way that's the most meaningful to you. Okay? So in a way, this is the greatest way that we honor the women, because the women didn't go along with the public code. The women went on, not what the men were doing, what the men told them to do, but the women went on, you might say, an inner sense of what is right. And therefore, what therefore is the custom of Rosh Chodesh? Women doing on their day what they think is right to celebrate, you might say, the independence of spiritually conscious thought. Now, I think it's a wonderful statement of how the rabbis understand women archetypally, but even more deeply than that, I think it's a wonderful thing for us to consider, because Rosh Chodesh happens every month. You can see it on your Jewish calendar. And so here's what I'm going to recommending. You know, it's again, have to start somewhere. So I'll start with you guys. That on Rosh Chodesh, have it be the day where we actually, each of us, create for ourselves the most meaningful way that we can remember to be the kind of people that operate from our own internal spiritual light, to do what is right, not assume that conventional morality is always going to be right, because it's not. But on the other hand, don't go down to the realm of emotions and the destructive areas, because we're being driven that way. There's a middle ground between, you might say, the public code and the code from hell that I call, to that beautiful point within of learning how to do the truly righteous thing. And so for me, this is the deepest archetypal meaning of the daughters of Zelophechad. Okay? Questions, comments, or thoughts? Yes?
What's an aliyah?
An aliyah is when you're called up to the Torah, like at a bar mitzvah.
Oh, okay.
Okay? So, you ever have a bar mitzvah?
No, I'm not Jewish.
Okay, so do you ever been to a bar mitzvah? Oh, come to my shul. Right, I'll show you what an aliyah is. Okay, anybody else? Okay, so we'll close for tonight, and I hope you enjoyed this interpretation.